Questions from you folks today as well. So on my far right we have Dustin Miller, who used to be with the League of Cities as a lobbyist and general counsel. He was also previously with the USDA. He's now with the Nyemaster firm, and he does lobbying and environmental work. I think many of you are familiar with Tom Haddon, who's the city manager for the city of West Des Moines, previously the executive director of the Metro Waste Authority, kind of the founder of Growing Green Communities, among other initiatives dealing with stormwater management and green infrastructure. And then Dave Dorff, 33 years with the AG's office at the state of Iowa, 30 plus, working on behalf of soil and water conservation districts and the Conrec side of the DNR. And he did a lot of work with WMAs and drainage. So we've got a really good panel here for trying to tackle the topic of who's responsible, who pays, or any other related topics that you're interested in discussing. So I'm going to put this in the middle, and we'll just kind of go down the row with a few opening remarks, and then we'll launch into some questions. So, Dustin?
I was kind of waiting for Dave and Tom's comments to take my own. Thanks for having me, and as Pat said, I'm most interested in answering people's questions. I find in working on environmental issues, when you get people in the room, especially water, I do a lot of water and air work, getting people on the same page so that you're not talking past one another is really important, and most people really don't understand the law as it relates to this area. The first and foremost thing I'd like to say, I see my friends from Clive here. I have a 5-year-old, I like to take him out to Living History Farms. I always wish it was more authentic. And the bedpans and that were still thrown out in the street so that people could really experience the first really combined sewer operations, right? But ultimately, it would take a short trip from here to maybe go to Alleman or a smaller community out here to see what stormwater used to look like, right? All stormwater, it wasn't complicated. It was ditches and culverts, a connection of those as to how you move it out of the town or out of places in the town that you want. It wasn't as regulated. It wasn't as quick. It wasn't as thoughtful. It was a matter of just moving water as an art of convenience. That all really changed from a regulation standpoint in 1987 when the Clean Water Act shifted to actually regulate stormwater. In 1987, there were amendments made that allowed stormwater regulation. That was then put in place in 2 separate phases. The initial phase was for very large metro communities, and then the second phase, which in 1999 impacted even people in this room. And I think, unlike how wastewater, how your actual sanitary sewer is regulated, stormwater still recognizes really the impact of private landowners and the public government. And it has to, for a positive MS4 to operate, how that collaboration has to work and how information has to flow from both sides and an understanding. It's amazing to me, I do national environmental work. If you don't think further regulation of your stormwater is coming, then you're not looking even a state away. I'm working on a very large project for the St. Louis stormwater sanitary district. And when I say large, I mean very, very large. And it's a green infrastructure project, all predicated upon an MS4 permit and how they deal with it. And I'm sure any of you in the room, city managers, public works directors will, and I'm sure Tom will nod his head, know that the old manner of dealing with stormwater from a consulting engineer standpoint was, let's just spend a lot of money everywhere. Well, I'm sure you're not all flush with resources, so it's important to understand how do you target those and actually achieve what you want within that regulation and how you move stormwater. But the reality is, a good thing for this Capital Crossroads group, The reality is we have to deal with growth, and growth means impervious surfaces. Growth means water probably moving quicker, and we also have to deal with the reality of two rivers coming together. And how do you move water effectively, but not just move it out and see it as an issue or a problem, but see it as potentially an asset for the community. And how you do that will take a lot of education on both part. I really thought about this from the two perspectives, because I think the city perspective is not something that necessarily developers or landowners understand. As I mentioned, folks don't grasp that in the increased regulation, there's always a connection to your wastewater system, even if it isn't a combined sanitary and wastewater. If you don't deal with old parts of your community, if you don't deal with new parts well, it's going to impact other infrastructure in your area. And ultimately, the city doesn't want to just ding people, but ultimately they're dealing with a permit with EPA and have to come up with a thoughtful manner. And ultimately, they have to develop this. Development has an impact on the overall system within the metro area and within your individual cities. And it plays a part in the long-term stormwater control. As you can imagine, a city and a government and a county has to do this in a manner that impacts everybody under equal protection, so that you're not treating people differently. So this has never happened before. If your city never ventures into it, you can imagine, I'm sure some of you have entered into that, where people throw up their hands, oh my goodness, I can't believe that you're making me do this X. This is my property, I want to sell to them. But developers really need that perspective of this isn't just something that the city wants to do willy-nilly, but ultimately it's something that there's an overall system that they're trying to impact. One of the questions that Pat gave to us is, how do you fund these projects? And that can be really difficult with the tools that cities currently have. You stick these projects within a long-term plan, but then the mechanisms that you use to pay for them can be very difficult. Whether it's drainage law, which I know Dave will talk about, or whether it's special assessments, those are very tricky tools. And special assessments and the formula that we use is really predicated upon roads and sidewalks. It's not about stormwater. So the tool in and of itself is difficult, so then you add into it that it really wasn't designed for stormwater can cause problems. But I think cities also need to look at the developer's perspective on this thing, and there are things that you can do. There's a huge importance in communication to landowners about what you're doing with stormwater, and making sure that your stakeholders in your community are part of the development process is hugely important. I'm dealing with a couple cities in Illinois where in the stormwater stakeholder group, we actually put together a checklist. So developers, it's not just, hey, you have to put in these practices. We gave them an option, and that was something that came out of the stakeholder engagement. So they're not fighting us on a stormwater fee. They're working with us to say, well, these are the things we would like to do. And you find it's a mixture of folks, but to get them into compliance, we give them a checklist. It's also important from the government side, consistency. And I know we're going to get to that discussion, and I'll end here. Potentially consistency across the metro area. What you don't want to have is developers running out of your town to another one because of an inconsistent approach to stormwater and to infrastructure. With that, I'll hand it to Tom.
Thanks. Just when I was driving here today, and this campus is huge. It's grown a lot since I couldn't find building number 5. It's hidden, apparently. But anyway, beautiful day. And what I found in my career in stormwater, before I was at Metro Wastewater, I was the city minister of Altoona, Iowa, and of course, anybody that's been in the city business for long, stormwater and or sanitary backups are your worst calls, but there's usually a direct relation to a lot of them. So over the years, when it's happening, as you know, we've seen all across the country torrential rains, floods, ravaging places, floodplains, coastal areas. You're thinking, why are they there? Well, then you go to a city on a nice, beautiful day like this, and the landowners are own land close to a river, and it's for sale. And it's for sale for a lot of money because that's all developable, and it's all they got to do is build up a foot above the floodplain, and they're good. Well, unfortunately, during the next torrential downpour, which is happening more frequently or different, we had a drought in July and tremendous rains afterwards. What I found also in my career, they don't go to the previous landowner when they got a problem. They don't go to the person who built their facility or building. They go to the city. We're supposed to have the answers. Even though we can decide who's responsible, we're saying, well, you built that, and you're kind of responsible for all the damage to your building, but that answer doesn't go too well. And then they run to the elected officials and say, what are you going to do about this? And so it's a really vicious cycle that we live in right now, especially to me, one of my pet projects is floodplains. We're working on a comprehensive plan, which we want to get, if you're in the floodplain area, you're going to have to get a lot higher than a foot above the 100-year flood because, that's changed a lot. And we are being very proactive in our various watersheds. That's the other thing I think is really important. It's what we've been working on this for a long time, right, Jennifer? Talking about watersheds, it's still not there, really. Watersheds know no boundaries between West Des Moines and Clive and Urbandale and whatever. Walnut Creek flooded down on June 30th, and we had gates, and Brian Hemeseth was very nervous and frustrated, and his shoes got wet, I think. And but anyway, that's a watershed that had that 10-inch, 11-inch rain part of it, and it impacted us tremendously. So we have to start getting our elected officials and our citizens and businesses to understand that we start drawing maps and showing watersheds, and I know Clive's done a really good job. Walnut Creek's been tremendous work has been going on that, but we have to continue in that, moving forward with that. So as a city, we are trying to be more proactive in how we're looking at natural areas, how to slow the water down, how to retain it. It has to do with soils too. It's just a matter of all absorbing in. We have to make more ponds, but we have a lot of streams and creeks that are really cool to live by. Again, and we have to be more, and I think we're doing a better job as a development comes in to say, hey, we want this area green because that stream is going to meander, it's going to erode, instead of we don't want it to take out your pool or your deck or whatever. So those are other things we want to be proactive on as a city, and we have a long ways to go. But we are going down that road, and our comprehensive plan is going to give us, I think, a platform to work on that.
I'll keep my remarks very brief here to start because I think my colleagues have a lot more experience in the field of stormwater development than I do. I spent, as Pat pointed out, over 30 years representing Iowa's soil and water conservation districts. There's 100 of those in the state, one per county, 2 over in Potawatomi County. And as part of my representation of them, particularly in the last few years, by the way, I retired in April, so
that's how we got him.
that's, yeah. I have a lot of time on my hands now. I would review a lot of the watershed management authority agreements that were put together, which, as you all know, involves cities, counties, and soil and water conservation districts. And of course, the most important thing to realize about watershed management authorities is there is no authority there. They ought to call them watershed management entities because they don't have any powers to do anything other besides what they have individually as either a city or a county or an SWCD. My work with soil and water conservation districts also led me into a lot of drainage and drainage districts type of issues. Drainage districts, I don't think, affect us down here quite as much. That's mainly, they mainly exist up in the northern part of the state, the prairie pothole country, where they had to drain the old swamps in order to get anything to grow up there. And then drainage districts also include levee districts, which we have a few of those, particularly over on the eastern part of the state. So, and then I have some basic level of familiarity with Iowa Code Chapter 468, which is the Drainage and Levee District chapter of the code. One of the longest chapters in the code, I might add, and probably one of the least understood. There was, during most of my career with the AG's office, only one attorney in this state, Jim Hudson from Pocahontas, who was the real expert on drainage districts. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to questions so I don't waste your precious time.
Well, I'd like to get to this question about kind of who's responsible, who pays. And so we've had this terrible flooding. Some of our communities have been hit repeatedly. So what's the responsibility really of the upstream players for the downstream impacts that are occurring? And those players are sometimes private developers, landowners, as you mentioned, homeowners, and then of course other communities. So when we think about this frame of all these different potential players, kind of think upstream versus downstream for just a moment. I hate to use that word versus. But talk to me about who's responsible, who's supposed to be paying for what. Who wants to go?
Because I'll start with the general principles involved here. In drainage law, there are what are called dominant estates and servient estates. And a dominant estate is one that is higher relative to a servient estate. A dominant estate owner has...
Quick question. Do you mean literally, physically higher?
Yes, yes, yeah. So the water generally flows downhill, as I understand it, from my old physics classes.
Still does.
Still does, good. As a general principle of law, the dominant landowner has the right to cast the waters that fall on his or her property onto the servient owner's estate, as long as they don't change the historical course of drainage or concentrate it. And that's where I've seen legal issues arise, is where someone puts up, let's say, a levee, and now that water can't flow naturally where it's supposed to go, and hurts the dominant landowner. And I've also seen situations where tile lines get put in, and now rather than having some type of sheet, rill erosion, you have a concentration which causes scouring and leads to gullies and other types of damage. So,
And that's not right, correct?
That's
something they're not supposed to get to do.
that is correct. Yeah. And a servient or someone who feels like they're compliance with the drainage law is not being met has a cause of action in district court for both damages and injunctive relief, which may require them to alter the natural drainage flow back to its natural course as opposed to a man-made course.
Are you for sale? You're a consultant? Are you working?
No, I'm not.
Darn.
But talk to me later, Tom.
Okay. We have an interesting case we've taken. We're waiting to go all the way to the Supreme Court on just this issue. We put, there's water districts, sanitary sewer districts, and we thought we would be very proactive and innovative. And I think the city of West Des Moines was in stormwater areas, because when people want to develop, there's culverts necessary, there's bridges, there's all kinds of things like that you have to do, and it's watershed based. Unfortunately, we've been losing to every step of the way, because the thinking isn't there yet that if I'm on the top of the hill, I don't cause anybody, I'm not responsible. I mean, there seems to be that they're not really responsible for water, as long as I guess they meet that, and that's what they're saying. But we know it is a watershed, and if you're at the bottom of the hill, then it makes it very difficult to do a development when they have to put a huge, some kind of infrastructure into it, deal with that. So we are dealing that. We'll probably have to go back to the legislature with some kind of approach so we could do that under state state code. So that's been a challenge. We also deal with the, since there is a lot of activity in the city of West Des Moines, construction, the private sector, of course, has to meet the 1 acre. If you disturb more than an acre, you have to take care of that. We monitor that very closely because if we don't, we have people who monitor it for us who live in a watershed, and they take a lot of pictures, and that's good, and we to a point. And so we see that, so we know we're accountable and help make, even though the builder should be. So there's a lot of things on who's responsible, but when you're doing the development, even though we have 23 million acres of farmland that have no true lateral requirements on them for disturbing the soil, we do, and so we can only control that, and we need to work on that. So.
To piggyback on Dave, the big key here is that movement of water in this state is constitutionally protected. And because of that, it can be very difficult to challenge the movement of water. So to Dave's point, if you have somebody with a dominant estate that's moving water onto you, even if there is damage, you're in for a fight to try and make that proof, which is the fight that Tom's going through right now, because again, the special assessment law, which was used in that case, was designed for roads. It wasn't designed for stormwater.
Can you clarify just a little bit the case you're talking about? I'm not sure everybody would fully understand it. Just the Cliff Notes version, if you can.
I'll do it so that Tom doesn't have to talk about open litigation. How about that? Yeah. You're welcome. So basically, the case is related to a special assessment for a stormwater. And in a special assessment, you assess benefits within it. And within the special assessment, the assessment of benefits, one of the individuals who was assessed disagreed with that assessment and fought the city. So they were assessed on their property taxes, and it's a 10-year payback on a special assessment. I don't remember. Yeah, you can. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So ultimately, a person can challenge that, and where it gets murky, goes to Dave's point, is the special assessment based upon benefits solely within the special assessment laws that are in kind of the municipal parts of code, or are we talking about the constitutionally protected drainage areas under 468, which are related to the ag part? That distinction, really, this case is more about the special assessment side, but the case law, and I'm sure Dave dealt with it a lot, related to drainage districts in urban areas is really murky. And there are circumstances where the county supervisors have unilateral control where they can hand the drainage to the city and say, now this is your responsibility. And so it's a law based upon trying to drain a swampy area to grow corn and soybeans, which we do very, very well. But it causes real difficulty in how you move water in a city community and then how you pay for it. On a responsibility side, the key with this is there is no key. You need a good attorney to help you walk through, the avenues of this, because ultimately, kind of the rules of thumb that you go off of. Well, if what's happening, do we have somewhat of a control over it? Do we control the drainage ditch? Is it privately owned? That's a real question that you have to ask. But I will tell you from a responsibility standpoint, what's scary, and what we saw in consent decrees from 2008 to 2016, I haven't seen as many recently, but cities are getting dinged with EPA on their wastewater side for basement backups. So something that a city basically has no control over, and they have no control over fixing in a private landowner's basement, the city will take a penalty within an enforcement. And some cities don't know that that's not part of the Clean Water Act, that it's really some aggressive attorneys within EPA that are trying to go after that. So they accept responsibility for those basement backups. But as you well know, you can go knock on somebody's door as many times as you want and say, hey, I really think you need to move your sump pump. into the storm sewer, not the sanitary, but they don't really have to do anything for you. So from a responsibility standpoint, really the big analysis is control, like how much control does the city have in this particular incident? And then I would layer on top of that is how you treat that situation better be the same as how you treat the next situation that comes in the door. And you better come up with a strategy, which I actually thought what Urbandale did, this cost share program, where somebody comes to them on the stormwater side. I mean, that's, if somebody thinks that they have a problem in their back ditch that is, privately owned, the city says, hey, well, I'm happy to help cost share with you, riprap or whatever. Those are the things so that everybody's getting the same deal, that you're not picking winners and losers in this, because stormwater is a difficult issue in how to manage it. And who pays, that again goes back to the responsibility. And in most of these circumstances, unless you have a large landowner that is really willing to fight it, hopefully you can have a negotiation up front with the city, and the city is willing to do that with developers. But I'll tell you, I have a situation just here in the metro area at one of the fringes, and a city with an MS4 dumping all their water with a lot of development. The instant that it crosses the road that isn't their city limit anymore, not my problem. And I think that's the kind of thinking, and I would say there are a lot of people in this room, I see Doug and other folks in this room that I know deal with stormwater all the time. Generally, they're the ones that understand how we're all connected and how you work. It's how do you get that across to the whole city department, and then how do you get that across to your citizens to understand that when you build a large-scale development, you are going to have an impact that impacts everybody, so who should share in those costs? Is that all one person pays for it, or is it something that we should share? That's a determination that a city has to really get into.
Can I follow up with a question for Dustin on this? Because I think he raises some issues when he talks about EPA going after some cities. At what point does an act of God defense become relevant? 14 inches of rain, let's say, in 24 hours. Is the EPA still going to, is it a strict liability situation, or is there occasion for an act of God defense?
That's actually what makes the Clean Water Act really difficult to interact with. The Clean Air Act actually has a 90% compliance standard, and the Clean Water Act has a 100% compliance standard. And every time that you are out of compliance, that's a maximum $37,000, $500 fine, civil penalty, irrespective of criminal stuff, which we are seeing in Sioux City. Some city council members are facing that.
Can you say more about what you mean by that, this compliance standard?
Yeah, so if you are out of compliance on your permit limits, whether it's chlorides or whatever is in your permit, that could be a violation. If you have a bypass, if all of a sudden you're...
How about sanitary sewer?
Sanitary, depending, stormwater doesn't have the same impact, right? The MS4 is different. But if you're not in compliant on your sanitary side, 100% of the time you're going to get dinged. Well, where that gets murky is, Tom knows, downtown Des Moines is still a CSO and will be for a long time.
Combined sewer operations.
And yeah, it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to separate out the two systems downtown. And if you get into the older neighborhoods, even that are separated, old clay pipes, infiltration, and so anytime I'm out of compliance, EPA comes in and says, well, these basement backups, and it becomes a negotiation. Now, what I find in cities, what's really fascinating is, I know this will shock Tom, that maybe your departments don't all talk to one another. On a nutrient strategy thing recently, I was dealing with a city where people are talked about this hot topic of nutrient trading, and I said, well, have you thought about stormwater projects that include green infrastructure? And the wastewater operators had to turn to the public works director and say, hey, is anybody doing that? Well, yeah. Oh, so you mean we've already built something? Yes. The two had never spoken and never made the connection between their sanitary sewer operation and their storm operation. And it's all a determination at the city level, which it should be. But, you know, interacting with Des Moines and the WRA is different than interacting with Cedar Rapids, which Cedar Rapids controls the solid waste, water, and wastewater in one department, but they don't control the storm sewer. So how everybody structures it is differently, but really those things have to work in tandem, because ultimately one person getting dinged could have an impact on the others.
What are your questions? I'm sure you've got a bunch of them, so let's get it started. Doug?
So one of the areas that seems pretty arcane in the state code with respect to the drainage law is the answer to what is an impact. Whether or not it's rate, or volume, or change of temperature, or change of course, or change of X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of ways that water from the dominant to the downstream side that can have an impact. But it seems like most of the case law then is related to a change in rate, which again, as we have all hopefully come to know, rate change is only one side of the impact, and in a lot of cases, it's volume that we're mostly concerned about. So curious from anyone's perspective how a challenge or case law might come into play with respect to getting clarification on what that downstream impact is.
I think you're Dave.
Yeah. Well, I would say any of those factors that you mentioned could be considered an impact. You know, when you're talking about concentration, and you know the law is pretty clear that you can't concentrate the flow to the detriment of a servient estate. Concentration, I think, necessarily implies that you've got a greater rate taking place and a greater volume taking place. Otherwise, I don't think you have the elements there to establish a concentration. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Or do you want to follow up? Does that address your question?
I think that's very helpful. Again, a lot of the more contemporary regulations that are being contemplated are trying to address the full range of impacts, which our old standards are mostly focused on rate control. So new regulations that have more concern for volume, for not just peak discharges, but peak discharges for various types of rainfall frequencies. And the argument from the developers, or developers engineers, is state code doesn't give you the authority, or case law doesn't have the background to indicate those regulations are proper. You're overstepping your authority.
Right. Well, and you're right. The cases in this area have generally developed on what a common law basis, meaning, you know, cases that end up before a judge and ultimately maybe an appellate court, you know, rather than being addressed by statutes. But, you know, I'd go back to that point that I was trying to make earlier that, you know, let's say rain falls on your 10-acre farm and you happen to be on high ground. If you just let it drain naturally, the servient landowners don't have a cause of action against you. But if you tile things in there, you may be, and probably are, you're concentrating the flow, and depending upon where you daylight that, that could have detrimental impacts downstream or down gradient.
So let me ask a follow-up. So when the cities are trying to be proactive and manage their stormwater prior to development and put in different projects, if you will, to try and manage that stormwater, and we get a 14-inch rain in 24 hours, and they have tried to be positive about it but have messed with the flow, are they putting themselves at some level of greater risk from downstream upset?
Want me to take this one? I'll start. Yeah, they're putting themselves at some risk. we have a couple of statutes in this state that deal with what are called tort claims. And tort claims are basically causes of action based upon alleged negligence or misconduct on the part of a party. And the State Tort Claims Act is Iowa Code Chapter 669, and there's a Municipal Tort Claims Act, which is Chapter 670. And the Municipal Tort Claims Act is the one that's going to apply to cities, counties, and any subdivisions thereof. So I don't have any firsthand experience with this, but I would say that if the engineering department for a city accepts a substandard stormwater development project, they could be liable for damages for negligence in allowing an inadequate system to be installed.
I'm glad Dave brought that up. I had that in my notes. That law is actually being challenged right now because of a county engineer culvert design. Some folks were drinking and driving on a small county road. A husband, I think, hit the culvert. Wife died in the car. Horrible set of circumstances, but somebody is now challenging. Generally it would have been, the design was fine, the county isn't liable because they hit a culvert. That's being challenged, which would open up the municipal tort claim even further, with a lot of cases trailing this one as well. So to Dave's point, that's the thing you have to be very careful of, is how you zone, how you plan, what you're putting in. You have to be very thoughtful about what is in this area. If I've allowed these folks to do this, and again, it's a far off, how do you predict the future? But it's something you have to be thoughtful of and be careful of, because the laws really weren't designed for a stormwater system. They were designed to move water from through the drainage district area, through the slope, and so it's not designed for you well, and so it's something you really have to be thoughtful about. But I could see a set of circumstances. Doug and these guys had a great presentation last week at maybe it was 2 weeks ago at TNC, and talked about how without the 4-inch topsoil rule, if people aren't adhering to that, water is moving quicker off their properties. It's not going into the soil. There could be a claim for somebody in the future if that's allowable. So you have to be thoughtful about how water moves generally. And that's why it's always so funny to me to go to big cities. In fact, I went to Houston. I do a lot of work in Houston. And I was there and watching all these folks run along what they thought was a river. And I was like, this just looks like a big drainage ditch. But they think it's, as you guys know, think it's a very nice amenity. Well, it was one of those rivers you saw flood, that March or something a few years ago. Many people lost property and lives in it. So, how you integrate this within your community, and as you well know, it's an all hands on deck that, in some areas it's pavement, in some areas it's bioswales, and sometimes it's just buying out some property, sometimes it's putting in, I drive across Southeast 14th every day on my way home, and I see, a big open piece of land that all we're waiting for is the next flood event for it to fill up, So those are the things you have to be thoughtful about so that you avoid that futuristic issue.
Other questions? Yes?
I guess I'd like to go back to where you're talking about changing the flow rate and concentrating the flow and maybe creating liability. One of the things I've observed over the years I've been with West Des Moines is 20 years ago, a single family plat would come in, and it's literally just broken into 80 by 120 lots. That's it. There's not an easement, maybe for an easement somewhere along the road or in the back of the lots for a utility, but that's it. Today when they come in, and I'm not sure whether it's on their initiative or we're pushing the envelope or what, but they're covered with overland flowage easements, minimum protection elevations, all kinds of detention areas and everything. So we've taken, and I'll back up, used to be when I get a complaint after a storm, my response would be, good, bad, or indifferent. Well, water flows downhill. Sorry, that's the way it always was. It kind of spreads out and you receive a lot of it. Now I've got people calling up saying, I've got a river flowing right next to my deck. I never had this issue before. Now it's all flowing in between my house and the neighbor's house, and it's 3 feet deep. And so I'm wondering if we're creating more issues by having this direction and trying to direct where the flow goes, even on single-family developments. I'm not sure if that's what residents or everybody here. I'm just curious what you think.
Can you hear me okay if I don't use this thing? Okay. Yeah, that's the hard part of this, right, is you're trying to corral the tragedy of the commons, right? It's the developer who's building on those 40 acres or whatever they're working on. They're not going to think about, well, I wonder how that's going to impact Bob's development. And I wonder how that's going to impact that green space that is there now in 10 years when somebody develops on that. I mean, and that's the hard part of your job, is how do I get these folks to not just think about their immediate impact, but their impact on others and what potentially is coming at them. And that's a real, unless you have a hydraulic engineer on staff, that's really difficult to model and to think about. But that's where I say to you, what you don't want to get into is the lowest common denominator, where you have one community out here not doing anything, right? So it puts pressure on you from developers of, well, I'd rather go build there. They don't make me. They don't care about the 4-inch topsoil. They don't care about whether I have a bioswale or that. I mean, that's the thing, is you have to get agreement on, is you're all going to impact one another. And Tom brought up the great example of especially that corridor of Walnut Creek. I mean, if Clive and West Des Moines and Urbandale, if you don't work together, it's a real problem. The Des Moines issue is much more difficult because the rivers are, impacted. It's not, Des Moines River raccoon is not flashy on an instantaneous amount like these little creeks can be, and impact property instantaneously. So how you interact as that crosses is hugely important, but difficult, right? Because you don't know what exactly is going to get built.
Tom, do you want to speak to this one at all? I think the question I thought I was kind of hearing is, are we begging a problem for ourselves by trying to do an improved management of stormwater because it becomes more visual, more apparent, becomes less of a traditional treatment, and we've called attention to it then? Is that kind of a fair take?
Yes.
So anybody else want to kind of speak to that?
Is the issue really doing something versus doing nothing?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering if our efforts to try to manage it, and I'm talking just about a single-family development. This is totally different how we're addressing it non-commercial and with all the detention basins and retention ponds and so forth. But on a single-family development, we're trying to, and I'm not sure, maybe Brian can respond to this. I'm not sure if we're saying you have to do this, or the designers are coming and say, we are going to put these flowage easements and we are going to establish where the water is going to go, instead of just going, well, it goes that way, it goes downhill.
And along that same line, the issue that really comes to bear is the point in time where the cost of grading becomes very economical. So 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have subdivisions that mass graded the entire landscape, created walkouts, which then concentrated flows into a shared backyard swale that then had to be conveyed. And when they started doing that, and nobody paid attention because it was just, water always goes downhill, once you concentrated those waters into common areas, and you had one person screw it up, regrade it, fill it in, whatever, everybody's screaming at the city, how could you let them do that? And then the city says, well, it's your property, there's no easements, there's no public benefit for us to be involved. That became a political problem. So now we've been in the mode of, let's make sure that never happens again, and started making sure the swales had easements and overflows and minimum protections, and now we've got, 400 levels of things to deal with to try to prevent the whining.
Can I ask who the parties to those easements are? Is the easement in favor of the city?
Yeah, a lot of,
Is it the landowner in favor, granting to the city a flowage easement?
a lot of them have ended up being termed public overland flowage easements. Again, to the benefit of the city
Yeah.
and all of the benefited landowners. And yes, we could certainly say, you are a benefited party, you go fight it out. But again, that conversation quickly goes to the mayor and council or whoever else.
Well, my sense is that those easements are designed to protect the cities from landowner claims of responsibility for not putting in an adequate stormwater system.
It is the stormwater system. It's an open channel.
It's an open channel.
Right, it's a
Right,
swale,
it's conveyance.
it's
Okay.
a common conveyance
Yeah.
that goes across 6 properties, 8 properties, whatever it might be,
Okay.
to an intake or a basin or whatnot.
And some of them are on a separate outlot that may be controlled by an association or something like that, but a lot of it's just private, the backyard, private single-family lots, and they're going, wow, nobody told me, I didn't know I was supposed to take care of the water coming down the hill, and you all directed it at me.
Well, if the easement was recorded against the property, and it shows up in the abstract, the landowner is on constructive notice of the existence of that easement.
I agree with that 100%, but if they don't know,
Yeah.
they don't know what that means.
Yeah, I know, and frankly, if you've ever looked at a title opinion, when you buy a piece of property and the examining attorney may say, here's some things you need to look at. How many people really look at those and say, and make the inquiry?
So there's still a public education piece that we
Absolutely.
keep talking around and talking about, and that's an essential part of all this.
Right.
I think some of the things that Rod's talking about, it prevents people from building a fence in a drainage easement that blocks flow. I think one of the things that, when you have a fence permit, you look for those and then make sure that those are in there. Another thing that it does, and now since, I can't remember what year it was 2007, with our MS4, we created the, maintenance easement and maintenance easement agreement covenants, so that we can go in and do things to private property if there's damages being done, and we can assess those costs back to the private property owners that are party to that maintenance easement agreement. I think all cities that are MS4s have those. Now, if we had that across the entire city, life would be so much easier. All of these things would be solved. We would just go in, fix them, assess everybody back, life is good. We don't have that whole. So,
And they don't follow the watersheds through that.
So you're bringing up, though, a point, too, that I wanted to ask about. We have heard in all of our discussions here the importance of consistency across the metro. And we're here as a part of the Capital Crossroads local government partnership. How do we get the consistency? How do we get something to happen across the entire metro? Now, you were talking about something specific to the entirety of the city, but the basic principle out here is, how do we get consistency? And to what extent did the state legislature need to be involved? To what extent is this just a matter of everybody playing nice and sandbox together? Visit with us about consistency.
I don't know the answer for the metro area as to how to do it. What I would say to you is, with what I see in other states, specifically the Chesapeake TMDL states, if you don't get consistency in this metro area, there's a real good chance that the next phase of MS4 says, well, we're not going to piece out individual MS4s, but for metro statistical areas, you have to have a single MS4, and all of a sudden you're going to be forced to work together, having had systems that ran separately for 20 or 30 years. And what you don't want to have happen, and again, I see this in some of the Chesapeake states, is to all of a sudden have, in their circumstance, they're having nutrient limits put on their stormwater in addition to the regionalization. And if it's tough enough just to agree on how you're going to collectively move stormwater, think about how difficult it is to then treat that stormwater. So I think that is coming, and it would be a much better conversation if you control your own destiny as opposed to letting somebody else come in and tell you how to do it in the future.
Jennifer, you work across the board. I mean, is there how are cities comparing? Are we fairly uniform, or we're not even close to? I mean, there are SUDA standards and others, but where are we at?
Right, I mean, that's one of the things that we were hoping to get at and talk about through this process. I think we have some similarities and we're very different in other areas. And so, until you really lay them all out on the table and start to talk, how can we regionalize this or look at this as a whole metro? I think, just moving the water is going to be hard, and then strategies for treatment is another side of it that, you may want to do differently or promote differently, but there's a lot of pieces to make that all work.
I think one of the starts of most of the cities all have stormwater fees in place based on impervious surfaces. So they're trying to, and we have found that it doesn't even come close at our level now to pay for all this demand for stormwater projects. So that's going to have to start ratcheting up. But I think there is a basis of that, and we do have to look at watershed-based issues. And back to what you said, Rod, I'd rather that we had the people getting educated slowly, but it's very slow, but to know that there are drainage ways, there is water. When water is developed, it has to go somewhere, and overland flow into different easements. I think this is good. It's just that we have so much property in West Des Moines that's private that has significant drainage operations happening, and it makes me a little nervous because I know we're a new, young enough city in some areas that it's not a problem yet, but it's coming.
And I would add to Tom, I mean, that's why I like the checklist concept if you're talking about a big area, because how West Des Moines wants to develop and look is going to be different than how Altoona wants to develop and look, potentially. So in a checklist where you give people options, downtown Des Moines, it might be very attractive for people to do a green roof. Altoona, somebody might not care about that. And if you can get that consistency where it's options-based, then all of a sudden a developer feels like, well, I'm still controlling my destiny on how I move that water. And it isn't just, you have to do X, Y, and Z. It's, here's A through Z, and I need you to pick 5 of those.
Do you know if the Iowa League of Cities and Municipalities has had any discussions about this issue?
No.
It might be a good one to bring to them.
One of the questions that I think might be worth talking about is that we come across a lot is private property versus infrastructure. A lot of times we're trying to help somebody that's got a water problem and they might own part of a creek or a drainage way that is servicing the stormwater exiting the development, and everybody's like, I'm sorry, we can't help you because that's your property, but they can't affect it because they own 70 feet of a drainage way that's in a watershed that's coming at them, where if it was a problem with power transmission, you'd take care of it, but it's water, so it's your problem because it's your property. So that seems to be maybe a question.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, right? Because if you get a navigable water or, things that are controlled by the Flood Control Act, I mean, that's really nice because all of a sudden, any of you interact with it's frustrating, but it's nice because the Corps owns a certain amount and you control that area. It would have been nice had the state been set up in a similar manner, right? Where you had that predictability based upon people being near a drainage area. You just have to deal with, I'm dealing with a city here in Iowa, and they thought, well, I'll go build a project in a river, but it's essentially a drainage ditch. It's a river that's impacted by a drainage ditch. They said, we want to go build a large scale, we want to, every place we own, restore it. And my response to them is, that's great, but if you only own 500 feet and you restore it, you've just concentrated the flow to the place that you don't own it. And then if you then go, say you don't own for 1,000 feet and then you own the next part, well, all you've done is impacted through your engineering here what you own over there. And that's the complicated part. That's why I say to you that the analysis for me always goes back to who owns it, can I have an impact, and if I don't own it, is it something that's in my future of, if this is ever available, is it something I want so that I can control my overall system? But that's a hard discussion when it comes to smaller ephemeral drainage ditches.
A lot of what we've been talking about here relates back to some of the original state law on drainage. And you've said over and over again here today that some of this was designed for roads, and then of course that was designed to drain swampland, not having a real understanding of what's happening in the cities today. I know this is a really big question, but if you were to highlight some primary changes that you would think that if they occurred in state law, they would be strongly helpful to cities, what might those be?
Stormwater feed district, which we kind of are talking about, which would be challenged, but it's got to be, it's a utility. I mean, water's utility, sanitary sewer, power, and now fiber. I mean, all these utilities. Stormwater is definitely a utility, and our weather patterns are becoming more emphasized. Just watch the network night in the news around the country. You never know when it's going to strike, so I think we have to take it seriously.
If you have multiple jurisdictions, we can all say that we're going to work together, and we can all come up with a common set of design standards, specifications, and everything. Everybody's following the same thing. But really, when you come down to it, each individual community is going to accept each of those and make it their law. But as we all know, the city council can waive any code requirement. So you've got West Des Moines or Clyde or Norwalk can just say, if they've got a friend, they may be able to get something waived. And then the whole thing's thrown out the window. If we had enabling legislation at the state level that required, I'm not saying that I want like more regulations, but how can you throw a federal regulation at us and expect us to comply with it when we don't have any state law to kind of go with it so that we can all sing the same tune?
Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah,
this
he's
concept?
right. I mean, I think it's a challenge too, because as you will know, your regulation on MS4 isn't even here in the state, right? Like you're talking to EPA, probably Region 7 when you have an interaction. They don't know what's going on in your community. And it's a real challenge to, the person maybe your public works guy's talking to on the sewer side. He calls down to DNR and they say, oh geez, we don't have any control over that. And it becomes a real challenge because I feel as if the MS4 stuff generally is, punching a shadow because you don't know who you're interacting with and why. And then all of a sudden, to your point, it's all these private individuals that you're dealing with anyway. How do you actually impact it overall in the city is a real challenge. So, to his point of how you pay for it is the big key. I think how you pay for it jointly is a big key too. As effective as the WRA has been, thinking about something like that overlaying for everybody working together. That we tried to do that in the water quality legislation. Tried to change 28F to regionalize water utilities, and that didn't make it in the final bill. But that was kind of the thought process too, because if you're looking at flood events like Clive, like West Des Moines, like downtown Des Moines, if you're looking at flood and saying this isn't just a localized issue, it's a watershed issue, if I need to slow water down, well, how do you jointly say, you pay this portion, I pay this portion? That was the other, taking the utility concept of Tom
and extending it further into the watershed. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think the state could be able to do.
You know, and if I could put it on my wish list, it would be to do something with those portions of 466B, I think it's 23, 2 through 25 or 6, to deal with watershed management authorities, and actually provide some authority in there to take actions against entities that are detrimentally impacting a watershed. Right now, you know, it's all voluntary, and I think that the idea behind watershed management authorities was a very good one, but I think we need to take it to the next level and put some teeth.
Time for probably one more question before we take a break and let these fine gentlemen go. What else did we not talk about that we should have?
I got a quick one, Pat. I noticed, I think all three of you talked about treating everyone equal. And this, it's not a loaded question, but it's just to get your thoughts on this. I know in cities, which most of us are, we go to great extents now to, we put silt fence and silts up, we protect every building lot. You know, you drive up and down new subdivisions and we do a lot of trying to keep the soil where it originated. You drive a mile out of town and you farm right up to the creek. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with this picture? And there's this rural and urban difference that I'm seeing as far as treating everybody equally. And I'm not trying to get, you know, pit us against one another, but I just wonder if you have any initial thoughts as to what we can do to try to make it an equal playing field, so to speak, between the rural and the urban.
That is a loaded question.
Yeah. Well, to the point of equal protection law, I would say that the whole concept of equal protection implies that similarly situated individuals need to be treated equally.
Okay.
If they're not similarly situated, then they don't necessarily have to be treated equally. When I was representing soil and water conservation districts, a lot of what I would do was deal with soil loss complaints, where you know, a farmer would go out and say, my neighbor is farming right up and down these slopes here, and every time it rains hard, I end up with a bunch of sediment damage on my property. And there is a specific process in 161A of the Iowa Code to deal with soil loss complaints. And those soil loss complaints, by the way, don't apply just to agricultural land, but they can also apply to urban settings as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there is the ability to file a complaint with the Soil and Water Conservation District, whether it's in a city or whether it's in a rural area. A lot of times, though, I've noticed that if cities have adopted ordinances that allow them to deal with erosion issues, a lot of times the districts will just defer to the city. But I think that the SWCDs still have oversight authority over those types of situations, urban or rural.
It is a loaded question. What I would say is this country urbanizes further and further. Our state is odd, right? Like if you go to Illinois, and I'm mainly a lobbyist, you go to Illinois and interact with their legislature, you have Chicago that really balances out the rural-urban discussion. Wisconsin has concentrated urban populations. We're different, even though this metro area is urban, the state still, I think like 50% of the population still lives in rural areas. How that's going to look in the future, the stuff I work on with the League of Cities is because if you use the traditional Clean Water Act mechanisms, it really doesn't make sense in a state like Iowa. Nitrogen is 92% non-point source, so the things you're talking about, phosphorus is 80%. So you can squeeze all the phosphorus and nitrogen you want out of the WRA, and it will have no impact to the Mississippi River. And so how citizens view that in the future, I don't know. I will say to you, the Farm Bill has been harder and harder to come by because of outside interests, urban interest, international interest. That I don't see that trend stopping. And people saying, well, if there's an impact to everyone, who shares in that? And I think, I don't know how long it will take for that discussion to go, but I'll say to you, like what Minnesota did with the buffer rule, I don't know if that's the way to go, because ultimately, I can put a buffer on an ephemeral creek that really has no impact. And then how do I enforce it, So all I've really done is made an enemy of a person, of the only person who's going to be out there every day that could be helpful to me to fix the situation, if that makes sense. And that's kind of the message I've carried to some of the environmental groups is, unless you plan on driving down from Urbandale to Decatur County every weekend to work on a piece of land, you might want to start working with the person that's going to be there every day. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough, for folks especially that aren't in that world, it's really difficult to see, well, does somebody care about the land when you hear stats about how much soil goes down to Louisiana every year. But it's a matter of education and changing practices, which, I'm encouraged by the amount of no-till that is going on more and more. But certainly it's a long way to go. But yeah, it's hard to look at that and say, these are all the practices and here's the enforcement action that I got from DNR because I didn't put a silt fence up. That's hard to see.
Can we do final thoughts real quick? We'll start with Dave and finish you guys up. Anything you wanted to mention that you didn't get to, or something you'd like to emphasize?
Well, I'll just draw a personal connection here because Jennifer and I worked together a few years ago. My niece lives on Walnut Creek, just west of 86th Street and south of Douglas in Urbandale.
Just upstream from me.
Yeah, and then my niece lived there, my nephew lives there now, and they've both dealt with some really wicked, stormwater events that have come down through there and partly changed the flow of Walnut Creek itself. And then I grew up on Walnut Creek in Des Moines, right across the street from West Des Moines, right off of 63rd Street, where they close the flood gates, every few months. So
It's not quite that frequent.
Seems like that place. I just thank Pat for inviting me here today to speak with you. There's no easy answers to these questions, but the most important thing we can do is just try to get the conversations going between all of the stakeholders who have these issues.
I had the pleasure of being co-chair of a couple of state task force on water quality some years ago, and it's all volunteer based in the state of Iowa as far as agriculture, and that's the 100-pound gorilla in the room. So what I've learned is, and what's kind of sad as you drive down the roads, I had actually the other day we were out in the country somewhere, and I was excited because I saw a cow. Because if you drive across a lot of Iowa, you see no livestock anymore. The days of the 240-acre farm are pretty much gone, where my wife was raised. A lot of people wax. I'm a city kid, so I think but that was what made the fiber of the state really good. We had all these small communities. You had small farms. They were working together. They didn't plow up their pasture. It was sloped land. It was common sense stuff we learned from during the 30s when the Great Dust Bowl. So what blows my mind is those practices. If you studied it or read all about the history there, they were very common sense practices. But we were excited about no-till. However, we're not doing a lot of other things that they even learned back then. So what am I saying? Okay, I have no control on that at this point in our history. So my thing when keeps getting my world, when I get keeping smaller, probably be in my backyard so I can make a butterfly garden possibly successful. Anyway, I am involved in a really fine city. So and with great employees, great staff. we have a really super parks area, mini parks. We're going to try the old theory of using what we do as examples and be more sustainable, whatever that word means. Some means the different things, but we could do a lot of cool things in our city, and I think our residents like it. Right? They like the trails. That's what we build on. They like it by water. They love islands. We have dirty water, but we love to be by it. By God. And so we can do some things locally, and then maybe the pendulum will turn someday on. There's got to be some type of regulatory or incentive with the farm program somewhere to get the big picture there of agriculture. Because my sad thing when all those research, what's the guy's name from Iowa State that does the great research of soils?
Tom Eisenman.
One of those guys has done, like, it shows a profile of our topsoil. It's so dramatic. I mean, what we used to have when the prairies when we started as a farm state, and now you look at the average profile of the state's topsoil, and that is the best resource in the world, and we're letting it go. So I mean, that's how we got to focus on. But I think a guy's got to vote, and we got to do what we can control and work on. And we're in this urban area, so we will work and I think make improvements here. And I think there's been a lot of cool things done.
I want to thank Nikki and Aaron for inviting me, because what excites me is I'm a kid that I'm from a little town outside of Des Moines, 350 people.
Ankeny?
Nope. And lived in a lot of different places, London, DC, I lived in Kenya, and I came back here, and in no way, shape, or form, like, people will ask me, well, hey, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? And I said, well, I live in Indianola, Iowa for a reason. Because it is very exciting what's happening in Des Moines, and I think for those of you that are in it every day, it might not seem that way. I think you see different aspects, but when you get the citizen complaint or whatever, but I will tell you, I bring water experts in once every 3 months, and we meet with stakeholder groups. They've never had a stakeholder group in any state related to water quality that included environmental groups and ag commodity groups in the same room. They've never had it happen. We meet every 3 months, and both of them come from the Chesapeake Bay, and they say, Iowa is more engaged and knowledgeable about water than any state they've ever been to. So my joke is, you say that to all the girls. But it's exciting because, with what's going on in water trails, with people's thought process on water quality, whether it was at where we want it to be or not, people are talking about it, and we're trying to get to solutions. So I just appreciate that, because a room like this, you can change the destiny of this metro community. So it's exciting with some real thought leaders in this room.
Thank you. Can we give them a huge round of applause? So the time is 2:20. Let's take a 15 minute break. 2:35.
Well, you're getting soft.
Yeah.
15 minutes.
Don't be late, and please, if you can possibly stay, I encourage you to do so, because we really have to come up with some ways to keep the momentum here moving forward. This is kind of our last official session together. Then there's the conference on October 2nd, and I think 1 hour was allowed to kind of have some conversation. We really have an opportunity here to give some good feedback to the folks at Capital Crossroads and have them participate with us today, and started thinking through kind of who needs to do what by when to move things forward. And those things might be in the topics of education, policy, technology, or I think we talked funding. So we've got 4 categories we're going to look at, and we need your help to do it. So with that, 2:35, be back in the room, be loaded for bear. We're going to have a great conversations and sharing, and we'll probably get out early today. It's really kind of a crapshoot whether it's best to have you all clumped together with your community today or whether to mix it up, but I think for the purposes of trying to promote the level of collaboration that we need to have happen, let's try and mix it up as much as possible. And so I believe the 6 tables I have are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you might need to kind of pick up your stuff and move if you're sitting next to everybody you came here with, okay? So try and mix it up a little bit, all right? It'd be nice to have West Des Moines and Clive and Norwalk and, you know, different players visiting each other. Education and outreach to citizens. Those are some of the kinds of items that are under here. On this sheet, this is kind of your recording and discussion guide. And remember, you need a reporter, a recorder, and a facilitator, all right? I didn't put it on the sheet because it should be pretty old school for most of you now. So make sure you have a reporter, a recorder who's going to handle this sheet, and a facilitator who's going to handle this sheet, okay? And so the first part of this is, I'll assign you your first topic, and then when you're done with that topic, you get to pick your second topic, okay? But I'll assign you your first to make sure we have a mix-up in the room. And the first thing is to look at the little list of stuff under your topic and add to that list. Is there some other approach, strategic direction, goal, objective we want to capture? Then what are your priorities? And then start to talk about what's on that sheet. How do we move your table's priorities in this category forward? So think about the roles of the people around your table. Recorder, write down some thoughts about your individual roles in this process. Then discuss the roles of all these different organizations we've been talking about. I didn't list them all by any means, but we got soil and water conservation districts, we've got MPOs, we've got the individual cities, we've got HOAs, we've got the legislature. You know, the list goes on and on. So talk about roles, who can kind of take on that role, and if you run out of time, jump ahead to the last question. Who needs to do what by when to move these priorities forward? That's really what we're trying to get to. Who needs to do what by when to move these priorities forward? All right? So, this is a really crude strategic conversation we're having, but it could be really valuable if you dig in as deep as you possibly can in the time allotted. We're going to take 45 minutes for the conversation. That includes a half hour for your first topic and about 15 minutes for your second topic. You may not get as far with your second topic, but you'll be really warmed up, okay? So, I think for this table, why don't you guys take technical? Why don't you guys take funding? Why don't you guys at that far table take policy? Why don't you guys take education and outreach? And you guys get to make a pick, but I'm going to vote for technical for you. Right? You can make a pick. And the purpose here of making sure we assign these topics is to get them all covered for the first time. So spend a half hour on that first topic, work through this sheet, and you've got multiple copies of this sheet at your table, and I can get you more. So fill in what your topic is, recorders, and make your notes. I'll come around and see how you're doing. And I said I'd give you a half hour for the first topic. It's now 2:40, so you go to 3:10 for that, and then you'll make your other choice. All right? We'll report out at 3:25. I think I just said that right. On to the rest of the crowd here, so we're going to let them go last. And let's start with our technical table back there, because I think they had a pretty good outline of what they were thinking their priority was and how they wanted to move it forward. So who's going to report out for us? And do we need the microphone or anything, or can people be heard?
They should be able to be heard, as long as they speak up.
Yeah, speak up a little bit if you can, and I'll get out of your line of sight here.
Outdoor voices.
Outdoor
For
voices.
technical, we had Iowa Stormwater Management Manual adoption. Number 2, adopt ordinances to ensure level playing field. Allow use of various innovative techniques. We added to that number 4, regional design standards and consistent inspection and enforcement processes across the board. Our priority in these approaches and strategies was the adoption of ordinances that level the playing field. So how we can get there? Propose a regional committee to come up with metro-wide standards. Identify funding sources. Get each committee to agree on this is the route we want to take, and develop a timeline for it. We'll probably be basing this timeline on the construction seasons. Then we'd hire a consultant. We'd compile all of our ordinances and let them do most of the grunt work. Then adoption by cities and provide, with these new ordinances or this new unified ordinance, provide education to our contractors. And this could be a possible step towards one regional MS4. Who needs to do what by when to move these priorities forward? Well, like right now in this room, we have a lot of representation from the different communities. You know, if this is an option that we consider, we can all agree on that, and we can start the ball rolling by talking to our elected officials. So.
Very good. Give them a round of applause. Talk about a checklist. Boom, 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 boom. What questions or comments do you have for this table on technical stuff? Kind of looking at a step leading towards a potential regional MS4. Any questions or comments? Thoughts?
Well, we had the technical stuff too, and I guess one of the questions we had after you had walked away was, can 2080 be used between all these communities to get the continuity we need between all of the communities? And can then the regional group that you have set up just set up a template of that 2080 so that everybody can just follow that and do that?
Do we have any lawyers left in the room? But my gut tells me yes.
Yeah, you can do anything you want.
But what's the purpose of the 2080?
To make sure that basically, it's like the 2080 that we have with you right now with the stormwater and the release that, to be honest with you, our stormwater study that we're going to share with you here is showing that it's not being followed very well, so that's why we're doing it. Right. But it's basically so that we have continuity between the cities, and it's basically everybody's got to follow the same rules essentially.
So it's the accountability side.
The accountability side, you bet. And I think what we talked about in our tables, there's two fundamental issues that are going on here. There's, I think a lot of what Clive is battling with is you've got a lot of your areas already developed, and you're battling what can you do to your already developed areas to make things better. And then you've got some of the communities like Ankeny and Waukee that are just exploding. What can you do so that Waukee and Ankeny and West Des Moines and Clive and their undeveloped areas are following all the same rules so that you don't have the developers coming in and saying, I can go to Waukee and do it this way, or I can go to Ankeny and do it this way. Those are the two fundamental things that we're trying to figure out here, and they're two totally different things, in my opinion at least. So and I think a 2080 type of a situation could probably fix potentially both.
It's an interesting concept to think about. What else did you guys talk about in terms of looking at that 2080 piece? How did you think you should step that forward, or did you get a chance to get that far?
It was about 2 minutes after you walked away and said we had 1 minute.
Yeah, I think that's true. So tell me the rest of your technical story here. Those were
so some stuff
good
we
highlights.
added onto the technical was, we know that some portions of the ISOM are being updated, so providing whatever assistance, comments, feedback on that to help it, become more clear, succinct, and user-friendly, whatever. Rainfalls, we know that they're constantly changing, and so how can we better keep up with that? It took forever. Atlas 14 came out, and it took a long time to adopt that, and SUDAS and all that. What else did we say? Having, flexibility, which we talked about a lot today, in those technical guides, so that depending on soil conditions and other site conditions, there's a variety of things to choose from to meet requirements.
So it's really kind of consistency of options.
Yeah.
And what's going to work at the top of the hill isn't going to work at the bottom of the hill.
Right.
And every city, even some sites have, you could have a 300-acre site that's getting developed, and what's happening on the top of the hill there at the bottom of the hill could be two totally different things.
Okay. But your point with the 2080s is similar to what they're coming up with, some way of looking at
How to regionalize it.
how to regionalize the stuff.
Yeah.
Very, very
Instead of
good.
everybody
Yeah.
to do it.
So, yeah, that's what's emerged as our number one priority too.
Very, very good. Anything else you guys need to share from your table?
Well,
Can I just-
Yeah.
we want legislative things to happen, but you kind of burst our bubble on that one. so-
I did. So this is my bad. I'm supposed to be your facilitator, so I should keep my mouth shut, but I've just been too close to it, the watershed management authorities. And I know that they were passed as authorities without authority, so that they would get passed in the first place. And I just think the potential of being able to go give power to the WMAs is a heavier lift than we might assume. I think that's a fair thing to say. Anybody disagree with me on that? Yes. So they're saying no. No. But I shouldn't do it. I'm a facilitator. So I should have kept my mouth more shut. But it's just a heavier lift than we might assume. Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to piggyback on the technical side is I do think there needs to be a marrying of SUDAS and Iowa Stormwater Management Manual. Because right now they're two, in some cases, conflicting resources. And one has funding, the other is beg, borrow, and steal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, bringing those together within whatever desired framework, SUDAS has already got a framework.
And West Des Moines hasn't even adopted the SUDAS. We still use the 1993 standards with our addenda. What was that supposed to be?
It's just so hard.
The SUDAS, for the most part, is our addenda added to the old
Right.
standards.
No,
So it's
I got
really,
it.
I mean, there's a lot of
I know.
changes that have been made, but when it started, that's what
I know. It's tough. It's just tough to get the traction. I know you guys have been working hard on getting the traction on that. I know that.
And Iceville was developed as SUDAS, and then it just didn't get in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, didn't that happen?
Yeah, it was.
All right, moving on. Anything other on the technical side? This was a very good conversation, really good thoughts. I love the concept of how you put the ordinances together and assessed, and that 28Es could potentially be used as a really constructive tool. And I love the point you guys are making about the fact that we've got these two big scenarios that we need to kind of cover. That which is incoming and that which is existing. Is that a way to summarize that? Yeah, very, very good. All right, this is our funding table, am I right? So funding table, probably always relevant.
I think sounds like kind of some of the same ideas as the other tables. Our starting list included adequate stormwater utility fees, stormwater district enabling legislation, and regional cooperation through the WMAs. Kind of building on that, we've discussed it would be good to have a mechanism that you can invest upstream improvements that improve your area, to be able to invest in those projects. Ability to adjust your rate structure in sub-districts, maybe some parts of town for whatever reason should pay more or less in utility fees in other parts of town. And for kind of private sources of funding, the option to have maintenance agreements. Our Urbandale already does that. We've got maintenance agreements for stormwater facilities, and that creates, in a sense, somewhat of a private funding source to improve and maintain those facilities that directly benefit that neighborhood. So the priority approaches and strategies, kind of that watershed approach to funding. The idea was a regional stormwater utility rate that goes to regional projects within the watershed rather than within the city jurisdiction, recognizing that could have some difficulties in implementation from a legislative and political standpoint, kind of keeping the idea of watershed approach to funding, but doing it within the jurisdictions, going back to kind of the WMAs taking the lead on that and deciding on projects within that watershed that could be beneficial. So yeah, we either need to have jurisdictions that will lobby the legislature for some changes to do like a watershed regional-based stormwater rate, or come together more under the WMA umbrella to make those agreements to do projects within the watershed. Along with that, of course, we'll need public education, both at staff level, city council level, and citizen level to understand why we're doing these sorts of projects. And what we've been doing so far, it takes time to move these priorities forward, to come together as jurisdictions to get on the same page and have the city councils get on board.
So you're saying from a funding standpoint, you're responding to what they're saying technically. We need this regional MS4 type approach, either through 2080s or whatever, and we need a funding mechanism that can support that. And so the funding mechanisms may, if we could get the watershed management authorities to have authority, that would be one path, but another path is by each jurisdiction getting some level of guidance from the WMAs for their role. Okay, and having permission to be able to invest upstream. Am I summarizing close? Okay, very good. Any questions, comments, thoughts for this group here?
Yeah, and I'm trying to write it down here. So correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it true that outside of a 2-mile radius of your corporate limits, we also talked about our desire to be able to impact upstream that might be outside of our existing jurisdiction. So don't we have a 2-mile radius outside of our jurisdiction now for our corporate limits to affect change?
Extraterritorial review.
What's that?
Extraterritorial review.
So there's a place in the Iowa Code where that is already sort of a precedent that's been set. It doesn't necessarily right now, at least, include our ability to affect stormwater improvements, but we're able to affect zoning regulations and building permits and issue these items for the reason of eventual or prospective annexation. So what we're asking for, what you're stating and what we're stating is not a crazy notion. The state of Iowa has already thought of this. And true, you want to do stormwater improvements that, maybe in Dallas County or maybe in an incorporated area of another community, but those are just overlapping districts. And urban renewal areas overlap inside and outside jurisdictional boundaries all the time. You can utilize an urban renewal area under TIF law that may be on your corporate city limit boundaries, and I can use tax dollars within corporate limits to affect projects outside my jurisdiction as long as it's in an overlapping urban renewal district. So what we're proposing, it just occurred to me, is not a new sentiment. If we were to discuss that at the Capitol, I think we could come up with some other examples of where there are places in code where you're letting us do this in other circumstances. Maybe we can apply some of that logic to what we're asking.
Yeah, and that's not about giving the WMA's authority. That's about taking an approach that's being applied for infrastructure and applying it to this piece of infrastructure.
We will never, I don't think we will ever be successful in granting authority to stormwater management organizations.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get that done. It would be a really huge feat. But what we might be able to do is, home rule still does exist. And so what we might be able to do is reclaim some of that authority under municipal right, a home rule authority, by demonstrating that that's being allowed in other areas of the code. Could we please also apply that same logic to stormwater management?
Yeah. Well,
That's
it's
all.
a creative idea. Taking it down. Creative idea. Cool. All right, very, very good. All right, policy people. Looks like you guys had some good conversation going.
Oh, yeah.
That would be you.
I don't know how to say what we talked about. Look at this, and then we didn't really answer any of the questions.
And it's all
so we talked a lot about things that you all had already discussed, sort of a myriad of design options to achieve the same result. Really, maybe our our first step would be to convene staff members, city managers, and below to say what is it that we can agree on, what is it that we can agree to understand together that our goals are, and just really baseline kind of stuff. But then allowing for some flexibility of how you might meet those regulations and standards. Understanding that not the same practice will be the best fit for each community. So nothing different than what you all have already said. Let's see. We talked about the upstream, the utilization of a 28F, so a combined financing agreement. You know, Brian's is the 28E is the agreement would be no different than like what we do on our CDB agreements, but now we're talking about stormwater specifically. So 28F, similar to code chapter, but just a funding mechanism. Let's see. We admitted we could all do a better job of explaining landscape design to our real estate developers, our real estate agents, our home buyers, and emphasizing the aesthetic beauty of these items or the upkeep necessary of these items. Maybe playing to a younger crowd of home buyers that are entering the market that desire a home that may abut with nature, and emphasizing the beauty that is happening in your backyard.
What did you guys kind of come up with as sort of your priority policy piece that you thought needed to kind of move forward?
So, it dovetails with financing, but to get the metros to agree on something, a uniform code of some type, and then also agree on what the menu of options to implement the policy would be. And then we talked about if a 1 cent sales tax is increased at the state level and 3/8 of that penny is dedicated to stormwater improvement, it may behoove us to preemptive legislature and say, here is a list of things that we could do for X dollar amount. As you create your funding opportunities for stormwater in the state, the metros have already agreed to the following regulation and criteria. We have a certified document that we've all blessed, and we are prepared, shovel ready for the following projects which will cost this dollar amount and have this impact if you approve the 3/8. And then we need to be able to demonstrate, I'm sorry, it's just simply true, we need to be able to demonstrate how our stormwater improvements in the metro will proactively impact rural Iowa. If we're not able to make that connection, I don't think we'll have any success. What? Brian's always talking about you.
No, I just said that's right, but it's bullshit.
You mean
It should be the other way.
Brian, you mean you're talking about the process.
Well, that's the state.
No, not
So
no.
that's our reality.
That we have to show.
JB, we're good.
Yeah, but that's where we live. That's our reality. While we commented that the state of Minnesota has the support, and the state requires that, so it's not the city people who are the big bad. I'm making you do this, Mr. Developer. The state of Minnesota is, the bad guy. We don't have that here, and so we have to work within the confines that we have.
So the who needs to do what by when to move these priorities forward, it's really about gathering everybody, getting some level of agreement and commitment around this myriad of design options, and trying to put in place some of these 28F and or 28E agreements, and then understanding maybe what some of the regional scale projects could or should be that you could talk to the legislature about to help secure the 3/8 cents sales tax piece.
And we have estimates on what that dollar amount would be. If there's an additional 1 cent sales tax based on last year's revenues, we can take 3/8 cents and figure out what would that pot of money be, how much would that be, and then everybody's projects prioritized. How many of those can we do? And then, like I said, pick the projects or score the projects that would have the greatest impact on rural Iowa and drainage ditches or surrounding counties.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging to kind of think about because, yeah, but we got to think downstream, not just upstream.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think we'd have the best sales pitch if we could also say, not only are these going to benefit Metro Iowa, but it will also, when you go back for eggs and issues, it will also be something that you can say to your constituents, and by the way, I've improved your drainage ditch because I voted for the 3% sales tax.
Okay.
But I don't think it's that far a stretch.
I don't think it is either.
The downstream people want volume reduction.
Yeah.
If you will, the agricultural people want to control the nutrients. You can go put practices up there and get more.
Right.
So your sales pitch is
Probably doable because if you're, yeah. All right, very, very good. Let's finish up with education. And any other questions or comments for that table? Let's finish up with education and outreach and your big question at the end.
Okay,
It's
so we
reporting.
failed. We
Okay.
don't have a reporter. We have two
You
reporters.
start with backing up, Jennifer.
Oh, okay, okay. So I'm the reporter. All right, so our group had education and outreach, and we were kind of all over the place because it all is sort of intertwined with the education and outreach. So, one of the things we really talked about is, okay, now we need to tell people, and the thing is why. Somebody pays, whether we pay now or later, and then what are the benefits? How do we do this and what's the best approach? So getting at some of those things kind of got us into really a lot of the first step is we're not just going to educate our way into it. We're not just going to go home and tell our citizens and all of a sudden the stormwater regs are going to be different and it's all going to be rosy. So then when we really had some conversations around that, we said, well, it's really talking to our elected officials and our department heads and making sure that the elected officials are going to give staff what they need to potentially adopt a policy that would need to happen in order to move forward in any sort of way, shape, or fashion that we talked about. So that's probably one of the main priorities is, out of this, looking forward is, are we going to be going out to, we want to get people to the October 2nd event, the elected officials. The mayors and the councils need to come to hear what that discussion is, first of all. And then after that, how else does this all move forward? We've had actually some really good ideas that came up around the table, but one of the things that we came up with is there a reason to do this? Do we agree that we want to take some kind of united message back out to all the different communities that have been participating to say, yes, the time is now that we want to look forward with that? So that was one big question that I thought maybe got answered kind of by what everybody's saying as we sit and struggle with these, but also just a true question to say, really, what are we going to do next to make this not just a fun summer exercise?
Right.
A couple of the other things that we really talked about is it probably takes the staff driving forward in the cities with the support of the elected officials council to do that. We talked about as we go back to the different communities in the past with this process, there's been maybe something to adopt already. And now it's a little different than that. It's more, will you support this approach? And we've come up with some really good ideas on what that approach kind of looks like from some of what the other groups are saying. But perhaps we also need a champion to be out there speaking to it that they're willing to listen to and seems fairly united. So I guess that's kind of drilling down into the education, but also opening it back up as a bigger question to the whole group as, really, what are we going to do now, and how do we move this whole thought process that we've gone through forward? What did we miss in this that we still need to delve into, and how do we function going forward to do that?
So if I thought I heard you correctly, kind of one of the things that your table is saying is there's this big question out here for all of us in this room. Are we willing to kind of step forward and try and make some of this work happen? That's what one of the questions was really about. Was kind of some level of personal reflection for a moment on you and your role and your capacity to help move something forward. How did we do there? How comfortable do you guys feel that you have a potential role to play and that you would like to help move this forward, make progress on this idea of some regional collaborative improving our stormwater management outcomes, at least across the metro, if not beyond statewide? Because this table was talking about the state. So what are your thoughts on that? Weigh in for me. Give me some thoughts. Are you thinking, yeah, I'm in? Are you thinking, no, I got way too much on my plate, I can't take this on at all? You don't have to commit today, but can you give me a sense of what happened at your tables when you started to think a little bit about your own personal roles? I know I made you guys talk about it. What'd you come up with?
Well, I think we kind of, I mentioned that it'd be great to have, I mean, at the end of this, having some type of document that kind of not only summarizes this, but has action points that we've kind of created throughout this entire process. Maybe some key understandings or whatever that we can take and present to our council or whoever, and be, just kind of a show. Like, it wasn't just me going to these meetings, to get out of work in the afternoon and, listen and just become educated so I, become a better worker. But this is actually something that affects the entire community. Other communities are talking about this. They were involved in this process. Just kind of show our work, I guess.
Good. Good.
Can I?
Yeah.
Gretchen will recall this as we've participated and done this in several iterations. But in the beginning, when we had multiple groups going at times, we did have the groups go and present to the councils on what exactly came out of the whole initiative. And we purposely sent, you may go to your council, but we purposely sent at least one or two other people to the council to present those outcomes. And I think about debris management. There was a lot of concern about acceptance and councils adopting and not just seeing it, and backing up, not just seeing it as another staff initiative that they don't give as much credence to. And so there is precedence in that kind of role of going back to your city councils with one of your colleagues here and presenting something like that, the whole outcome with these specific action items.
We talked about that kind of approach here, and you might, say what your reflections were, that they liked that, but felt they wanted some other high-level kind of champion there, because really it's not going back with, here's the debris management policy, now you all need to back us, so this is what will work. It's, do you support as a council and mayor, continued effort to come up with some consistency on a regional basis and some strategies that will enable us all to move forward, together rather than individually. So the question for them is, will you support that continuation of that work? And then if we come back with something like an ordinance or common standards or fees or whatever, that's the next step. But right now we're just, okay, will you support that next step? But so we talked about that, but please weigh in on how you guys, you had good, they had good comments about it's not just the elected officials that they're getting at, it's some of the other department heads that see this as being, lots of extra work and effort and not being there yet as far as understanding why it's important. So the idea of the takeaways and presenting that back, here's what we learned, why this is important, maybe in a work session or something that includes the department heads and, as well as city manager and electeds.
I think was what you were getting at.
Yeah, and the big thing is that it may seem as simple as go and adopt an ordinance. If you go in with that mindset, it's gonna fail. It's changing a lot of ways that you've done things over the course of time. It's gonna change who's maintaining stuff and who's talking with different people. And it is a philosophical, fundamental type of evolution from waste product to assets kind of concept. I think it is a little bit hard to try and convey that message in a 5-minute citizen presentation portion of your council agenda. And it's also pretty hard for, unless you really are digging into it as a staff person, becoming half knowledgeable, it's awful hard for that person to bring the weight of all of that to all their other department heads and city manager and legal counsel and everybody else. So that's why, again, we're kind of saying maybe there's a champion, somebody that can partner up with the individual community or staff people to help.
That's what you were describing, kind of the key takeaways, put in a nice format with, references back to the things that it came from, the experts from which it came, that would help.
So who might be an example of the kind of champion you're talking about? Maybe under a different frame, you can give us an example.
Well, you gave the example of Rick Towson
For the water trails.
Yeah, let's get him to be the stormwater.
But he's a business leader.
Right. Well, yeah, he's a development
Development.
company guy, which.
Yeah.
We talked about the importance of playing up the aesthetics of these features and making sure that developers know that these can be nice features for quality of life amenities. That might be a pond with a trail around it. And with West Des Moines and Waukee sitting next to each other at the table, I said, well, Holmes Murphy didn't move to Waukee and move into Kettlestone for nothing. They wanted a pond with a walking trail, and that's what they wanted for their employees. And they wanted to be able to see that in their, look at their conference rooms and see that. And we didn't have that to be able to provide to them. We have a pond at City Hall that they're all day long. There are people and employees that walk around. So if we were able to reach out to some developers and have that conversation that you're talking about, Gretchen, where we say this could be a really positive benefit. It might not always be filled with water, but people in your from your workplace or your business, people who are looking to build homes, let's focus on less of this is a cost and you have to do it, or we say so, but that this is a benefit, could be a benefit for your property values as well. You can charge more money, whatever.
Well, let me see if I've got this straight. Kind of a broad over, and what time is it? Second from the phone. It's 4 o'clock, so let me try to do a 30-second summary, right? And that is that to tee off this kind of collaborative effort that will help us understand what we might want to adopt on a more regional basis. We need some document that captures what we've learned and our high points and where we think it needs to go. That needs to be presented to our councils, both at the October 2nd conference and then to the councils themselves in partnership in some way, perhaps if we can pre-identify a champion, to kind of tee this up for the folks in this room and or some other folks to be engaged in a process of developing the collaborative, high priority stuff we need to do to get to push toward that regional MS4. And so we've got kind of this initial education summary piece to get started with, and then we're going to bring a team together that's going to look hard at ordinances, maybe with the help of consulting initiative that will do the heavy lifting because we're all so busy. And then at the back end of all that, we'll figure out a process that may be 28E or 28F related, or perhaps we'll have some legislative component and we might be able to be successful, so successful, that we can help an initiative to pass the 3/8 cents, if we can identify the right projects and capture that in our final document. Am I sort of close to what this conversation's been about? And am I hearing that maybe not everybody, but most of you in this room would be willing to do some additional planning to try and help make this happen? Is that fair? I'm seeing a lot of head nods. I'm not seeing 100%, but I'm seeing a lot. Is that okay? Any other final thoughts? Final comments? So we would walk out of this room with the number one charge you have is to get your electeds to the morning session on October 2nd. That's 7:30 to 9 a.m., where they will start to hear about all of this. And then on October 10th, we will have a document in front of you that you'll get to critique and tear into, that we will make as helpful to you as possible, and then we will further plan at that event how to take that document back to your elected officials and launch this whole education initiative and start to figure out how to do the collaborative piece. Is that fair?
One just a quick question. Are we promoting the other department heads in cities to attend October 2nd as well?
Why wouldn't we?
I think that's, I really heard a lot about that.
But just don't let that be a substitute for your electeds.
Right, both.
You got to do both.
We got to have both.
Yeah.
Get across those silos.
Fair enough? I can't thank you enough. This was an unbelievably great conversation, really worthwhile. And please be there on October 2nd and bring several people in tow. And we'll try and be ready for you by October 10th with some really good documentation.